favorite theologians is the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, former pastor of Riverside Church in New York City. Great man of great dedication, Christian faith, and commitment to peace and justice, and we surely miss him as he has joined the community of saints. He wrote a little book of some of his sayings and reflections, and one of my favorites is, and I quote from Reverend William Sloane Coffin, he says, "I love the recklessness of faith." He says, "I love the recklessness of faith." We don't usually encourage one another to be reckless in anything because sometimes that's unsafe and somebody can get hurt. But when we are reckless in faith, Sloane Coffin says, first you leap and then you grow wings. First you leap, then you grow wings. Recklessness in faith means that you're daring enough to step out over that cliff and know that somehow you're going to grow some wings before you hit the bottom. Many, many years ago when I was reckless, I was learning to rock climb. And one of the things that you have to learn when you rock climb is that once you get up, you have to get back down. And one of the things that you can do is you can walk back down, and sometimes that's possible. You can take a trail back down off that cliff. And sometimes you cannot take a trail. You have to do what's called rappelling. And rappelling is the fun little thing where you back yourself off the cliff with a rope around your waist and through some hardware, and you just kind of drop off that cliff, and you control your future destiny. You can control that rope, and you can go as fast as you want. You can keep your feet on the cliff if you can still reach them, or you can just fly off that side of that cliff. Maybe you've seen some people rappel off of cliffs or high buildings or things, but it's quite an experience of faith to set yourself back off that cliff. And if you do the thing that I usually used to do, I used to look down. That was the bad thing to do, because then your knees start shaking and you wonder, how are we going to get off of this peculiar position and get back up? And you can't get back up once you start leaning back. And so you have to have faith in that rope and that hardware that's around your waist. You have to have faith in the instructor, if the instructor is there teaching you how to do it. And you have to have faith on the person who's holding the rope that is also around your waist, a separate rope, in case you do slip, that person can hold you back up. And when I think about rappelling and I think about going off a cliff and taking that step in faith, I also think about all the things that bind us up, that keep us from taking that step off that cliff of faith, that prevent us from understanding that we can grow wings when we take that first step off in faith, that we can be actually a little reckless in faith. I think about all the things that bind us up. They're real matters that bind us up, that prevent us from acting in faith. There are relationships. We have relationships with one another and family and the workplace. There's certain relationships that we have that kind of bind us up and hold us back from living out our lives in faith. And we also think about all the conditions that we live in this world that are so real, economic and social conditions, that bind us up in our faith lives, that sometimes we're afraid to act in faith, to take a risk, because there may be an economic or social consequence to living out your faith. Our faith lives are complicated too. They're very complicated. Relationships and conditions and opportunities that come our way to express our faith are complicated in a way that sometimes cause us to be bound up in doubt. Saying, well, I really feel God's calling me to take a risk and to do something, but geez, I'm not sure that I should even try. And I don't want to disappoint God. I don't want to disappoint anyone else, so maybe I won't even take that risk. You know, part of faith life is being willing to take a risk and even fail. Did you know that? Now living in faith and being a good Christian is not always being successful. Sometimes you fail. Now, the big thing about failing as a Christian is that you don't stop there, right? You get up and you start again. You don't want to become a pile of dry bones. You don't want to become one who's stuck in that tomb. And sometimes taking a step out of that tomb or into that wilderness of dry bones and calling upon God's Spirit to refresh you is what you have to do time and time again, because there'll be multiple failures if you're living out your life in faith. But we're not a people of failure, we're a people of the resurrection, we're a people of success in faith, because we keep trying and we trust in a God who has our back. So there's no doubt or discussion that our life choices can bring to life many, many great joys. And there's no doubt or discussion that our life choices can even put a damper on our faith. And for some people, some of us have even experienced this in some ways, that our life choices can even put our faith to death, which is a very frightening thing. Life choices can turn us so far away from God, not God away from us, but we can make choices in our lives that will turn us away from God, and we can even say, God is no one to me. We had a testimony last night. Jim Alt, who was here showing the wonderful film African Christianity Rising, told a little bit of his faith story, how he had grown up in a Methodist household. His father was a pastor, later became a bishop, but there was a 20-year period in his life where he was an atheist. Grew up in a Methodist church, but for 20 years, and he was off into Africa. He was trying to figure out what he had for a future and to apply some of his academic skills, but he lived for 20 years saying God was dead to him. Made life choices, but he also made life choices to come back into the faith. He took a risk somewhere along that line. He stepped off that faith cliff again, and he grew wings, and now is a believer committed to the Church of Jesus Christ and the United Methodist movement. The experiences that we have in life, in faith, can reveal the truth that we need to see over and over and over again. And when we live in faith, we experience the power of God's truth, the power that God is with us. When we open our eyes and our hearts to the presence of God, even in circumstances that would tell a reasonable-minded person that there's no presence of God here. Again, we're looking at the Ezekiel text, imagining that field of dry bones, where a commonsensical response would be, there's no God here. Look at it. This is nothing but the evidence and footprints of death. We often find ourselves, again, bound up in these complexities of life that can point us in that direction where we too may conclude that, look, there's no evidence of God here. Life is just too hard and unfair. How could there be a God in the presence of these complex matters? I'm without a job. My family is struggling. I'm nearly homeless. I'm living with such pain and disability. I'm struggling with the cancer. How could there be a God in the presence of all this dry bones? And what it comes down to oftentimes is that we get stuck in that place, that field of dry bones, and that those conditions and circumstances where we ask that question and we wait for an answer. We wait for someone to say, oh, you're right, there is no God. But it seems to be always that question in our minds and our hearts, but it never gets an answer because deep within us, we know there is a God. Even in the midst of the dry bones, even in the midst of the dark, cold tomb of Lazarus. And it's not until we dare to take that risk, to take that step, to unbind ourselves from whatever's holding us back, giving us that mindset that there is no God. It's not until we take that risk that we just start to discover that we are bound up in all these complexities. But if we just start to loosen them up a little bit, we find the Spirit of God weaving into those knots and that material that binds us up and untangling it. And we find ourselves moving with a little bit more freedom, even in the midst of the reality of the complexities of life, whatever they may be. We find ourselves a little freer to take yet another step in faith. And I know there is really no chance that we can completely undo ourselves from the responsibilities and challenges and opportunities that life brings. I know that there's always going to be some matter of being tangled up in the complexities of life and the realities of life. But as people of faith, life is not just focused on what tangles us up. You see, if you're just tangled up, you're stuck here in this earthly existence, and you're not thinking about the presence of God in your life. You're thinking about just what you can feel and sense in the existence of your life in that moment. As people of faith, we believe that God is very much alive and in our lives. And so we open our hearts and our minds to the idea that if I feel all bound up like this, if maybe I just move a little bit, the God that I know and love and who loves me will find a way to start creating some new room and create within me the power of new life. And just in the moment that you think that the complexities are so tight upon you, you start to feel something loosen up. And that there's some new space there for you to move and breathe. You don't feel as constricted, and even though maybe those very complexities haven't changed technically, you feel the freedom. And maybe you name it as that life-giving spirit that God has come upon you. The same very spirit that gave those dry bones new life. The same very life-giving spirit that we take that beautiful image of the sinew coming back together, and from that rattling noise of the dry bones comes the rattling of new life, and they reconstruct, and the people of Israel, which is a beautiful story about the people of Israel coming back to life as a nation, and God doing what God promised to do, which was to get them to the land of milk and honey and restore them even after years and years of war. The Bible story of the Valley of Dry Bones speaks to us of this nation, of a people who really came to believe that the complexities of life and their situation had led them to breathe their last breath. They were experiencing the strength of the powers of death. The whole house of Israel, talking about the whole house of Israel, a whole nation, a people, God's people, coming to believe that there was no cliff of faith for them to even step off, that everything had been leveled by the powers of death, and that there was nothing for them to do but to get drier. To get drier. And the drier they would get, I imagine they thought they would just become that dust. Dust to dust. There was no life for the whole house of Israel. And then there's this verse that tells us they were hopeless and lost. They were cut off. I can't imagine what that felt like. For a people of God to feel cut off from God. Can you imagine how hopeless they were feeling? These were a people bound up by the powers of death. For them, faith in God was limited. It was so limited. It was so tiny. And there was no reason for them to take any risk at all. Any risk. But there was this one prophet, old crazy Ezekiel. What do you do with people like Ezekiel? When you just want to crawl into the cave and say, just move that stone over here and just turn the lights out. Then there's that one crazy prophet who sticks his foot right there between the tombstone and the door and says, not yet, not yet. God's not finished here with you yet. Roll it away. Open it up. Let's see what God's going to do. And here Ezekiel opens up his heart, his mind, his whole self to God. And God says, prophesy. Use my words. To those dry bones. To those people feeling cut off.